video game prequels. Games that not only have to try to pretty much expand upon mechanics and everything from the previous entry, but also make it make sense within an earlier setting and everything, because sometimes you may want to expand on mechanics, but then forget that, oh yeah, this will take place before a previous event or something, so oops. Such as, for example, the prequel game Batman Arkham Origins, that has to tell, as the name states, an origin story for Batman and everything, while also using so many of these villains that generally don't get a huge spotlight when it comes to the previous entries. You know, trying to take some of the villains and be like, hey, you're more important now this one. Come over here, kind of thing. But it's one of those things where they want to expand upon the gameplay of the Arkham series, of Arkham Asylum, feeling basic by comparison to its sequel, keyword, by comparison to its sequels, because of how many upgrades and updates have been made to it, including the fact that Arkham Origins has stuff such as Batman wearing armor plating for his suit, something he doesn't wear in Arkham Asylum at all. We can go like, wait, why does he have better technology here than he did in that game, kind of thing. Or the fact that Arkham Origins also has gadgets that function similarly to those in Arkham City, like the glue bomb and the freeze bomb respectively, stuff like that. But once again, he didn't have an Arkham Asylum. And yes, Arkham City does have a note where Batman says he starts out with less tools because having a huge tool belt slows him down, but it's one of those things where they want to expand upon what was previously done in the games, but that's like, why does Batman have this here and not here? Which is the whole balancing act of wanting to improve upon gameplay, but you can't introduce things that would then also break what's been established beforehand. You gotta follow a certain rule set and limitation that a sequel doesn't actually have to follow. Or it could be something like Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep, a prequel title that's set 10 years before Kingdom Hearts 1, but has these Keyblade users using abilities that Sora never had in the first game, specifically because these Keyblade wielders are way more adept. Terra, Ventus, and Aqua are better Keyblade users in Birth by Sleep than Sora was at Kingdom Hearts 1, so they have these abilities that Sora didn't have, like the Keyblade armor or Keyblade transformation, stuff that Sora doesn't have because he doesn't know how to use that. And even Sora needed the assistance of the fairies at Kingdom Hearts 2 in order to actually even get dry forms, which are something the Keyblade wielders of Birth by Sleep don't have. So different explanations for stuff like that. And then down the road at Kingdom Hearts 3, Sora now has Keyblade transformations like Birth by Sleep characters did. Don't ask how we got them. With Birth by Sleep in particular, needing to also essentially lay the groundwork of the franchise villain and explain what exactly has been going on in the entries that follow up it. So there's this part role out of a prequel, in fact, so I would say it's probably one of the most important entries in the entire franchise, because of the groundwork it has to lay down that the entire franchise afterwards then needs to follow when it comes to setting up the overall narrative that continues on in the entries and eventually concluding the arc in Kingdom Hearts 3. You also have something like Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII, a prequel designed to go further into the character of Zack Fair, someone who in the original Japanese release of Final Fantasy VII only really got like 2 lines total, not much, but then when they got localized it for internationally, he then got an entire sequence to further flesh him out, and now an entire prequel design to further flesh out his character and explain his whole entire narrative that happened before the events of Final Fantasy VII. Although this entry is kind of divisive, because some of the stuff it explains either didn't explanation, it adds in character situations that weren't there in Final Fantasy VII, thus contradicting events and retconning it, or even just has stuff that you're attributing to Zack that are unnecessary, like, oh, Zack is the reason Aerith thought about selling flowers for 1 gil, or oh, Zack's the reason why 7th Heaven is called 7th Heaven, like stuff like that are pretty minuscule, but you didn't really need this particular character to be the reason for it, even if we were established this character does exist in the universe of Final Fantasy VII. So it's one of those things where you can equally see why someone will believe that, oh, we didn't really need a prequel title for this character and everything, even as the character himself, as Zack Fair, became very beloved. But you can still see why they wanted to just expand more in this character, and even just random mishaps within Midgar or the locales, because of the fact that you can pretty much go around the place and do these side quests that add more stuff to everything. Like I said, it's one of those things where you could question whether or not you need them more, on top of Crash Core needing to also do the balancing act of not stepping on the toes of Final Fantasy VII, which it does end up doing at times over the character Genesis and how he interacts with characters with Sephiroth, but also get an opportunity to see Sephiroth before the events and Nibelheim incident and everything, to get more with characters like him. Gameplay-wise, Crisis Core tried to experiment more action RPG setting because of the fact that we only have one playable character in the game, so you need to change up how the materia system function, and it's probably a better system here than was in Final Fantasy VII proper. But then you also have the fact of, oh, you need to fuse materia to get new abilities and stuff like that, which you can also see in like Birth by Sleep that I mentioned earlier in this video, similar mechanics, but it's one of those things where you can kind of see like experimentalness of it. On top of the fact, it also highlights what kind of jobs a first-class soldier does, which tends to pretty much just be whatever random BS Shinra thinks of throwing you at, because of the fact of the mission system just being little bite-sized things you can do that do have their own narrative going on with them, but it's one of those things where this is what being a first-class soldier is like when it comes to the day-to-day grind of working for them? Okay. While I'm mentioning Final Fantasy, I might as well mention Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin. Despite Origin in the name, Stranger of Paradise is not a canonical to Final Fantasy 1. It's instead based on Final Fantasy 1 the events, but tells its own story and everything that becomes apparent throughout the game. But because it's titled Final Fantasy Origin, many see it as basically, oh, it has to be a canonical prequel to Final Fantasy 1, when it isn't, because the game actually contradicts many aspects of Final Fantasy 1. Even early on, that's the fact that Stranger of Paradise's levels are based on levels of other Final Fantasy games, which obviously Final Fantasy 1 doesn't do, kind of thing, you know? Two other prequel titles I want to mention are Halo Reach and Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity. Both games have to tell a story where, of course, being a prequel, you know the outcome, but it also means you're just seeing the outcome happen, and seeing in the case of these two games, you know if you played the games that follow up after them, things don't necessarily end well, with Halo Reach, despite being a prequel title, having one of the most beloved final missions in a video game, where you're just given a single objective of survive, where people meme heavily on that. And I mention these two games together because Age of Calamity also has the same thing, and you need to follow this whole entire war that happened before Breath of the Wild took place, but you know the outcome and know that things are gonna end well. The difference being that Age of Calamity tries to swerve things by instead being its own alternate continuity, so things may not play out the same as their Breath of the Wild. So then the game is very upfront with, repeat that, it is very upfront with, people keep complaining the freaking advertising lied, it didn't lie, they were very upfront, even in the demo, when the first thing you see is an alteration in time. Legend of Zelda, time travel is very abundant, alternate timelines is very abundant. It's one of those things where Age of Calamity, people expect it to be like a Halo Reach kind of thing, even meme about it with the whole entire objective to survive, but it is different because of the fact that Age of Calamity decides, but do these events need to happen? Is this going to happen, or does the knowledge of future events mean that the timeline will shift? And stuff like that. An interesting direction to take a prequel title. Castlevania 3 is probably an entry in that I'd be bringing in this video when it comes to major video game prequels, considering by that point people didn't really think much of narratives when it came to Castlevania franchise. But think about it, the stuff that happened to Castlevania 3 basically shapes the franchise from then onward, whether it be Trevor Belmont, everything, or an established character such as Alucard, who then becomes a major player within the Castlevania franchise, everything. Castlevania 3, despite being a prequel title, you probably wouldn't think of prequel mattering much, ends up doing a lot of groundwork for future titles. Like Castlevania 3, this wouldn't have stuff like Wonder of Blood. Without Wonder of Blood, you wouldn't have Symphony of the Night, or a computer antagonist, and without Symphony of the Night, you wouldn't have the Metroidvania subgenre as we know it kind of thing. It's one of those things where, despite not being a big when it comes to narrative, the groundwork it lays by introducing these characters into the fold ends up doing so much for the Castlevania franchise. Some would say it ends up doing more for the franchise, given something like Castlevania Lament of Innocence, which was designed to be the very first timeline-wise entry in the franchise, as meant to explain something like the vampire killer, or why the Belmont clan specifically are the ones to hunt down Dracula every time he returns. Devil May Cry 3: Dawn's Awakening. What do you have to say about this? Alright, okay, I gotta talk about it. Is the prequels meant to revitalize the franchise after people didn't really like the direction that Devil May Cry 2 went, having a, well, he is quippy, but more broody, I guess I'd say, Dante, compared to the first entry. So Devil May Cry 3 is there to not only revitalize it by going towards earlier years, but also basically the game ends, or the ending quote, pretty much encapsulate the direction how they try to pretty much move the franchise. With Dante saying about having to fight demons and everything is that he loves and that he's crazy about it. Highlighting there, pinpoint there, done, sign the movies, what Dante is going to be about in the future entries. Do they do more Dante as a character? Yes, but it's the thing they want to pretty much set the tone of what the franchise is going to be like. Even the reboot game not only has a ton of references to that game, whether it be something like the achievement name and stuff like that, but also keeps the spirit of Dante being this person who does love fighting demons, everything, but also has more stuff going on besides that, because I swear some people feel Dante as only being this whole entire, oh, he Wacky Wahoo Pizza Man. And that's a meme, but people associate with that so much to the same degree. But it's one of those things where also gameplay-wise, it's essentially how the franchise moves forward. Having multiple weapons, having different styles, so the point when Devil May Cry 3 on Switch was retroactively designed to essentially play more like Devil May Cry 4 and later 5 of, oh, you can have all these weapons, you swap styles on the fly and everything, this amount of freedom in Dante's combat, but also how he keeps collecting more and more weapons and stuff like this, that keeps it more Mega Man-ish kind of progression. At least Devil May Cry 3 was a weakness system that it's hit and miss for some, but it's one of those things where it's like, it set the groundwork for the franchise would be by trying to go back to a more earlier Dante, and then just ignore Devil May Cry 2's existence in later entries and how Dante acted within that title. We got Sonic 3 Snake Eater, a prequel design to the story of how Naked Snake became Big Boss, with not only an interesting premise of trying to explain that story with Big Boss as essentially the protagonist, but also because of the fact that up to this point, all the player knows is that Big Boss is this massive villain and was the villain of Metal Gear 1 and 2, with everything afterwards essentially being this whole entire thing that started because of Big Boss being this starting incident that led into this whole entire thing, where even stuff like villains in MGS1 will constantly reference Big Boss. MGS2 will have villains reference Big Boss, and I get to see the tale happen. And it's also being a prequel set so far back, is also rather self-contained. You'll get more out of it if you play the previous entries, but it is designed also you can play it as the first entry, which is also why it got remade like a solid Delta Snake Eater, because you can play the game just separately on its own, even if you do get more out of it by knowing previous knowledge. Gameplay-wise, I want to also flesh out the more hand-to-hand combat with the CQC system. That made it better when it came to actually dealing with enemies up close, but also for interrogation. That was kind of awkward in bits when it came to previous entries, but now it's more enhanced that future entries would also use. It also has a jungle. I don't like the jungle in MGS3, but it has it. I don't know, people keep using some sort of accolade, but honestly, I just don't care for it. I just don't care for the jungle setting. I don't care for it. But it's one of those things where it to not only establish Big Boss himself, but also establish his whole new rogues gallery within Snake Eater, including the boss, who's a beloved character and villain in the franchise that essentially carries Snake Eater very hard when it comes to villains in that game, at least. And then they didn't stop there, because then we also got Portable Ops, Peace Walker, Metal Solid V Ground Zeroes, Metal Solid V Defense and Pain, just many games that followed Big Boss as the protagonist role and everything, and keep telling this story that they're probably done with when it came to that, to the point MGS3 or Peace Walker, but they kept going anyway. They kept going with more and more games that just keep going. That's all I gotta say about it. Big Boss kept getting more and more games. It's also an interesting case because MGS3 came out obviously after MGS2, where MGS2 left you with questions that were limited answers. MGS3 then has to essentially go, screw you about those questions, we're doing something else now. But on the topic of Naked Snake's games essentially being prequel titles that dominate a franchise, let's also talk about a game franchise that having more and more prequel titles, which is the Star Ocean franchise, because ever since Star Ocean 3 to the end of time, every entry afterward is a prequel title, because the events of Star Ocean 3, I guess developers didn't really feel like they wanted to make a game that takes place afterwards, even if Star Ocean 3 essentially created limitless potential for where Star Ocean could go afterwards. Like I said, 4, The Last Hope, 5, Integrity and Faithlessness, and 6, The Divine Force are all games that takes place before Star Ocean 3. With Star Ocean 4 in particular being designed to essentially be the first entry timeline-wise and actually explain certain things that are in the franchise, such as the Galactic Force and the Horn rules of what people who go through space are and aren't allowed to do. In order to explain this, heavily referenced thing that Star Ocean 3 especially constantly references that, hey, the Federation says I'm not allowed to do this and this when it comes to visiting another planet. It meant to explain that, but 5 and 6 are, once again, more of a case of they just don't want to follow up Star Ocean 3, because it is heavy shoes to follow Star Ocean 3's narrative. Many people bitch about Star Ocean 3 and want to get to the franchise, but I mark it more the case of the fact that Star Ocean 3 just has such a major twist that we can take license the entire franchise. I say in a good way, many say in a bad way, but it's a fact of trying to follow up it. It's a daunting task that I feel like developers generally are kind of too scared to do, you know? So Star Ocean 4, what I'll say has been this prequel designed to explain a lot of rules that the Star Ocean games follow when it comes to what the Galactic Federation are allowed to and aren't allowed to do. A prequel entry that I've seen get flack because it has to wrestle with the fact that it is a prequel is Resident Evil 0, that tells the story of Rebecca and Billy, with the complaint being the fact that you meet Rebecca in Resident Evil 1 and everything, and there she was not the most combat capable person. So to give her an entire prequel title where she's not only combat capable, she actually fights a prototype tyrant, and then say she is not capable in Resident Evil 1 is one that people tend to have issues with, because it's weird to give this character a prequel title that then has to pretty much kind of also not exist in order for certain aspects of Resident Evil 1 to make sense. We'll try to explain it away as, well, she went this one-time adventure in Resident Evil 0 and now she's probably exhausted, but she's also just kind of alone in rooms a lot in Resident Evil 1, so the fact that she can't handle herself in that game kind of ridiculous, especially with question, where did her massive arsenal from 0 go? Like, the idea that Resident Evil 0 exists because of, oh, I just had this prequel story and everything takes place before. This one entire gameplay dynamic of something between Rebecca and Billy. This one entire gameplay aspect, and it gives more to Rebecca, but also in the process doesn't really take into account of, great, what about how Rebecca acts Resident Evil 1? And you just gotta scratch your head on, whoops. Or how Resident Evil 4 constantly tries to put this dynamic between Leon and Jack Krauser, but there's nothing in the game to actively put this dynamic, was where the prequel title Operation Javier, which is part of the Dark Side Chronicles, is meant to fill in the gaps. Where that one's a weird case where it's released way after the fact and meant to fill in gaps that Resident Evil 4 itself created, but I want to have this dynamic, but not actually fleshing out the dynamic and just being like, these two know each other. When? Where? I don't know. And down the road they're like, okay, here's this prequel meant to do that. And there are games that do leave in holes that are meant to have a prequel title fill in, but it is a case where I feel like the prequel title was designed way after the fact, and that's something a gap they put in to pretty much fill in the gap, you know? Last one I'll mention is when choose your own adventure games kind of also do a prequel that then has to try and explain stuff that may not exactly work with the established story. Like one I mentioned is Life is Strange Before the Storm, where you play as Chloe in this entry instead of Max. Where you go as one-time adventure, you do have dialogue options and everything for Chloe to go with. The issue being the fact of, well, it has to follow the events of Life is Strange, so even if there's stuff here that may have you like Chloe more as a character, if you don't like Chloe in the proper game of Life is Strange, or even something like, let's say, her stepfather, David, it may irk you how the characters can act in this dynamic here that then has to be fully ignored by Life is Strange proper, since, well, that story is already written, so they can't write it around what this prequel is doing, or the choices the player can make in this prequel kind of thing, you know? Well, there are certain dialogue options in this game that are designed to, hey, we're not trying to have a better relationship between Chloe and her stepfather, David, when they have a bad relationship in the main game that is toxic on both sides. It's one of those things where, like, you can see the ideas of trying to do this one-time thing in a prequel, but then the game can't really follow up, well, Life is Strange proper can't follow up on it. So if you like it more here, then you may be disappointed, on top of the one-time aspect of which order you play the games. And I say which order because there are people who may start with a prequel title before the main game. And granted, many prequels are designed for you to go in after experiencing the main thing specifically, but there are cases where people may pick up a prequel first. I played Crisis Core before playing Final Fantasy VII itself, so I knew everything revolving Zack and everything, the truth of Cloud, before even playing Final Fantasy VII proper, which is a dynamic developers thought of when it came to seeing it as interesting of what if someone plays the prequel before the main game itself. There are some people make it their goal to play a prequel before the main game, but not every narrative is designed in that kind of way, you know? Or every game is designed that kind of way. Like, sure, you could play Yakuza 0 before the Yakuza franchise. You could play Batman Arkham Origins first, but the gameplay updates are there because they were made after so many other entries. So when you go into Arkham Asylum, or go into Yakuza 1 or whatever, 3, the gameplay may not be up to what you're used to because you just played the end results of many years of gameplay updates, even if it takes place earlier within the timeline. Or even just mysteries that didn't have answers at the time, like playing Red Dead Redemption 1 after playing Red Dead 2. Red Dead Redemption 2 will explain a lot of stuff that when you play Red Dead Redemption 1, you can start out and just have no idea what's going on, why these characters are so hostile towards each other, or when his intro has Dutch just shoot John. And it's a kind of dynamic where if you play Red Dead 2, you know the dynamic. But you played it as Red Dead 1, where there was no prequel game, it leaves a mystery for you to follow. But you play Red Dead 2, you now know aspects of the relationship. It's an interesting dynamic that makes it interesting if you play a prequel first before the main one, you know? Whereas you can say the same thing about when it comes to playing a sequel before the first entry, but a prequel taking place beforehand is an interesting case, especially since there are prequels that do also spoil future events. When they get baffled by that idea, or a prequel that's very relevant, like I mentioned Birthplace in this video, that's very relevant for games that came out after it, But there are people who be baffled on why does the prequel game matter so much to future events, because the future events are molded around this prequel story now being known. Just want to ramble about the Hunter aspect, especially that last part about years of gameplay improvement, but it's a prequel title, so people will think, oh, I'm gonna go with the narrative order, but these are also video games and they have video game orders. So yes, you can play Yakuza 0, everything, and start out there. But don't complain when you then play a future entry. Like, I know the reason Kiwami get a version, but one of those things where before then people complain about playing Yakuza 3 because, oh, 3's gameplay was basically this whole entire start of a new kind of combat that 4 would update, 5 would update, and then you got 0. But if you start at 0, then 3 and 4 are gonna seem, 3, 4, and 5 are gonna seem lesser by comparison because of it. But that's not fair to the game. You can't blame Yakuza 3, 4, and 5 for playing how they do when they were setting the groundwork and updating that Yakuza 0 and has to take advantage of. Like I said, was one aspect when it comes to prequels and how the video game part can pretty much affect how you view a prequel and everything. So I want to say that, alright then, go out there, play games, whether it be prequels or not, or you can play the prequel first before the main game. And yes, there are cases where a prequel title can try and fill in information or do stuff that can actually make the game that follows up worse. Like, I know people complain about the Bioshock Infinite DLC, Burial at Sea Parts 1 and 2. They're meant to fill in information, but instead just retcon stuff, you know, that makes things worse. Or like I mentioned with Crisis Core, we're just saying stuff like, oh, this was like this because Zach did it. Kind of feel like, okay, you need to attribute these aspects to Zach specifically. Alright, that's all I gotta say. Alrighty then, good day.
Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII. Now, I have played a little bit of the original on the PSP, but I did not fully beat the game until I played Crisis Core Reunion on when it came out on PC and consoles. So it's a good prequel story. I like it. It tells the story of Zack before the events of Main 7 transpired. I will say, you know, hot take, controversial opinion, but again, this is me. I'm speaking for myself. This is my personal preference. Genesis is the best. Genesis is the best. Genesis is better than Sephiroth. That's right, I said it. To me, again, keyword, to me, personal preference, Genesis is better than Sephiroth. Now, don't get me wrong, I also like Sephiroth, but I have to specify I like original Sephiroth. I like original 1997 FF7 Sephiroth and Advent Children Sephiroth. I do not like remake Sephiroth. But yeah, Crisis Core is a good game overall. I liked it. Zack's story was very fun to go through and very sad at the end there. It did get me a little emotional. Felt bad for Cloud. It was nice to see, you know, the squad in their younger days before they became the squad. So you see like a young Tifa, young Aerith, a young Yuffie, obviously young Cloud here. I like Zack. Zack is cool. Zack is my man. I like Zack. But Genesis is... I love Genesis. That is such a unique and cool villain. I like Genesis. I wish he was used more. But yeah, I really liked Crisis Core. Batman Arkham Origins prequel to the Arkham City trilogy. Now, I have played all 4 of them. I love all 4 of them, but Origins is my absolute favorite. To me, I felt like in Origins, Batman was like way more violent, way more savage than he is in the trilogy. Like, yeah, I know about the memes, like, you know, he knocks people out and then he's like, now talk, and he breaks their bones and stuff. Yeah, I know. But to me, his actions in the trilogy felt more tame than how he was in Origins. In Origins, that's primarily the reason why I love Origins so much, is because he is so violent. He is absolutely so violent. Like, if it wasn't for him being Batman, I'm pretty sure he could easily kill everybody. But yeah, I liked everything about Origins. The combat was definitely more my favorite. And I just like that he was, to me, he felt way more violent than he did in the trilogy. That's primarily why I like Origins, but good story overall. And now I saved the best for last, Yoshi's Island. Now this is a strong part of my childhood. I am aware that Yoshi's Island was originally a Super Nintendo game and this is a GBA port or whatever you call it, but this is the one I grew up with. This is my first introduction to Yoshi's Island, so I'm going to be talking about the GBA version of Yoshi's Island. Now, growing up, my first Game Boy game was Super Mario Bros. 3. And then after that, I can't remember the rest specifically, but I know this was among the newer ones that I got at the time. I would say this was probably in maybe my top 5, top 10 of like my starting saga when it came to gaming as a kid. Again, I can't specifically number it down to when I got it, but I know I got it eventually. And everything was beautiful about it. The music, everything, like, you know, the worlds, the eggs, the enemies, just like, I never got bored of it. I never got bored of it. I would play it over and over again, always 100%. And the game had 3 save files, and I would 100% all 3 save files. And when I was done with that, I would erase one and start all over again. I never got bored of it. I made sure to, like, collect all the red coins, the stars, not the stars, excuse me, the flowers, and, you know, to get the secret bonus levels, and then do the bonus things where you, like, get bonus items, or, like, lives, or eggs, or etc. And it was endless for me. I never got bored of it. And I especially like the final fight. Spoilers. I especially like the final fight where you fight Baby Bowser that turns into like Mega Bowser, and that music that plays, that was so unique because like throughout the whole game, like each of the bosses have different gimmicks, but like for this one, you're like throwing, you gotta like time your egg throw all the way over yonder before he comes running to you and just blows everything up. It's just Yoshi's Island is definitely near and dear to my heart. It is a great part of my childhood. That menu music, every time I hear it, I get a little, I'm not gonna lie, it gets me a little emotional when I hear the menu music. It brings me back because that was like such a pivotal, important factor in my childhood. So every time I hear that, it just brings back nostalgia, good memories for me.